"Annabelle, wake up," Mrs. A called from the kitchen. "You would be late for school. Come on." "I'm coming, Mama," Annabelle replied, rolling her eyes. She covered herself with the duvet and sighed. She wasn't particular in a hurry or interested in school. She finally managed to remove the quilt, dragged herself to the bathroom to brush her teeth and take her baths. She dressed in her school uniform, picked up her bag and went to the kitchen to take her breakfast. The plates where she ate were left on the table. She took off. Annabelle was the only daughter of Mr. and Mrs. A, and they had high hopes for the future of their only child. But lately she had changed. The good girl was lost, and the once obedient girl was living life like she didn't have rules to follow. As soon as she left home, she saw her two best friends, Janet and Fate, outside the gates. The trio laughed loudly as they walked down the streets, their school bags swinging casually behind them. Janet was tall and bold, always coming up with ideas that landed them in trouble. Fate was a little quieter but no less mischief. They were inseparable, and Mrs. A, all she wanted was for her daughter to stay away from those girls. "Annabelle, I've told you not to associate with those girls," her mother had said the night before. "They are bad influences, they would lead you astray." "Mama, please," Annabelle said, "they are my friends. They have done nothing wrong, you have to believe me. Those girls would only put you in trouble," her mother had warned, but Annabelle thought she knew better as they walked. Janet suddenly suggested, "Let's not go to school today. Tony said we should come over, he's having a party, and his friends are coming too." Fi's eyes lit up. "A party this early?" "Yes," Jeanette said, grinding. "You know Tony doesn't follow the rules, his house is the perfect spot." "What do you think, Annabelle?" Faye asked, turning to her. Annabelle hesitated for a moment. Her parents' warnings rung faintly in her ears, but she quickly shrugged them off. "Let's go, school can wait." The three girls changed their direction and headed towards Tony's house. Tony was Janet's boyfriend, a 22-year-old. No good job, he lived in a dilapidated apartment that always smelled like alcohol and secretes. When they arrived, the music was already blasting, and a group of jobless young men like Tony were in the living room, and he greeted them warmly, offering them drinks and snacks. "Relax, ladies," Tony said, dragging his arm around Janet. "This is your home too, you know." Annabelle laughed nervously as one of Tony's friend, a tall young man named Kelvin, began chatting with her. She didn't notice the time slipping away, nor did she care. Meanwhile, back at home, Mrs. A was passing the sitting room and checking the clock every few minutes. Something didn't feel right. Where could she be? She asked her husband. "She should be in school," Mr. A said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. She would be back later, but Mrs. A's motherly instinct told her otherwise. It was way past closing time, and she was worried at Tony's house. The girls were having the time of their lives, laughing and dancing. They never went to school that day at all. Annabelle felt a kind of happiness that she couldn't explain. This was freedom, she thought, and built this was what it meant to leave. But deep down a voice kept whispering to her, "What if your parents find out?" The day passed quickly, and as the sun began to set, the girls realized that they needed to go home. "What do we tell our parents?" Fate asked nervously. "We will say we had extra classes, of course," Janet suggested. Annabelle nodded, but her heart raced. She didn't know how long she could keep lying. As they walked home, Annabelle couldn't shake the feeling that this time her parents would deal with her. This time Annabelle tiptoed into the house that evening, her heart pounding as she imagined her mother's reaction, but her efforts to sneak in unnoticed were futile. Mrs. A was waiting in the living room, her arms crossed, and a sad expression on her face. She had been looking for Annabelle all over the place. "Where have you been?" she demanded an answer. Annabelle froze. "We had extra classes," she lied, avoiding her mother's piercing gaze. "Extra classes," Mrs. A repeated, her voice rising. "Do you think I'm a fool? Your school dismissed hours ago." I lost track of time," Annabelle stammered, knowing her excuse sounded dumb. Her father walked in from the bedroom, his face grim. "Annabelle, this behavior of yours is unacceptable. You are banned from going anywhere for 2 weeks, from going out except for school, and no visitors." Those useless girls you call your friends are not even allowed to step their feet in my house." Annabelle's anger flared. "That's not fair. Dad, I'm not a child anymore. Don't you dare talk back at your father," her mother snapped. "Go to your room before I close my eyes and open them for me." Annabelle stormed to her room, slamming the door behind her. She grabbed her phone and texted Janet and Fat, venting her frustrations. Her parents didn't even know that she had a phone. "This is why you need to stand up to them. Jet said they can't control you forever. I talk to my parents anyhow I like, and you need to learn that." To Annabelle, "Don't be a coward. They are just your parents. They have no authority over your life," Janet said to Annabelle. Fat chimed in, "Exactly. Annabelle, you are 16. They need to respect your decisions." The following morning, Annabelle pretended to head to school as usual. She met Janet and Fate at their usual spots, but instead of going to class, they went to Kelvin's house. Kelvin and Annabelle had become couples from the party at Tony's place. Kelvin greeted Annabelle with a wide smile, pulling her into a hug. "I missed you," he said, making her blush. Kelvin locked the door immediately. The girls entered his room. He couldn't wait to get down to business. The days turned into weeks, and Annabelle's visit to Kelvin's house became frequent. She skipped school more often, spending her days with him. Instead, Janet and Fate encouraged her every step of the way, telling her that she deserved to live her life the way she wanted it. And at home, her parents were growing more suspicious. Mrs. A noticed Annabelle's grace drawing and received complaints from her teachers about her frequent absences. One evening after dinner, her parents confronted her. "Annabelle, your school called again today." Her father said, "You haven't been attending classes regularly. Where have you been going to?" Annabelle crossed her arms defiantly. "Why are you always on my case?" "I'm not a baby," her mother gasped. "Annabelle, we are your parents. It's our duty to guide you. Don't you see the path you are taking is dangerous? You just don't understand me," Annabelle shouted before storming out of the room. Janet's words echoed in her mind. "You need to stand up to them." Back in her room, she tested Kelvin. They added again. "I can't take this anymore." "Don't worry," he replied. "You can always come to me." Annabelle smiled, feeling assured. Little did she know that her choices were leading her down a path that she might one day regret. One morning, Annabelle left the house, her school bag hanging over her shoulder. Mrs. A watched from the kitchen window, her heart heavy with suspicion. Complaints from Annabelle's school and her sudden change in behavior made her worried. She decided she would get to the bottom of it that day. Quietly, Mrs. A followed Annabelle, maintaining a safe distance. She watched as her daughter met up with Janet and Fate, laughing as if they didn't have a care in the world. Her heart sank when she saw the girls changing direction, heading away from school. "Where are they going?" Mrs. A asked herself, quickening her pace to keep up. After several turns, the girls arrived at a small apartment. Mrs. A hid behind the tree and waited. Moments later, a young man opened the door and greeted them warmly. Annabelle stepped inside with him, her laughter like a needle piercing her mother's heart. Mrs. A's face burned with anger. She marched to the door, her fury growing with every step. Without hesitation, she banged on the door until it swung open. Kelvin stood there startled. "Ma, who are you? Where is my daughter?" Mrs. A demanded, pushing past him. Annabelle appeared from the living room, her face draining of color when she saw her mother. "Mama, what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" Mrs. A shouted at Annabelle, tried to explain, but her mother's patience had run out. She grabbed Annabelle by the arm and yanked her towards the door. "You think you can embarrass your father and I?" Mrs. A yelled, her voice trembling with anger. "I warned you about this behavior." Kelvin stepped forward, but Mrs. A shot him a glare that froze him in place. "Stay out of this." She backed Annabelle's friends hid by the corner of the room, dragging a humiliated Annabelle down the streets. Mrs. A ignored her daughter's protest and the stares of passerby. When they got home, she ordered Annabelle into the house and slammed the door behind her. "You are grounded indefinitely," Mrs. A declared, No more living this house except for school, and I will personally follow you to school, and pick you up after school." Annabelle said nothing, her face dark with anger that evening. While her parents were out, Annabelle made up her mind. She packed her clothes in a bag, her heart pounding in her chest. "They don't understand me," she muttered. "I'll be happier with Kelvin." She sneaked out of the house, and made her way to Kelvin's apartment. When he opened the door he looked surprised but pleased. "I couldn't stay there anymore," Annabelle said, stepping inside. "I'm staying with you now." Kelvin hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right, you can stay, but are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Annabelle replied, though deep down in her heart, she was uncertain of her decision. As night fell, Annabelle lay awake, wondering if she had made the right decision. Annabelle adjusted to life at Kelvin's apartment. Quickly to her, it felt like freedom. But it was a freedom her parents would not tolerate for days. Days passed without any word from her parents, and Annabelle convinced herself they had given up. She had no idea that her parents were silently planning their next move. Her parents thought that she would regret her decision and run back home. But after waiting days and she didn't do that, they decided to take action. One afternoon, as Annabelle sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, there was a loud knock at the door. Selvin opened the door. "Are you Kelvin?" one of the officer asked. Behind them was Mr. and Mrs. A. "Yes," Kelvin replied cautiously. "You are under arrest for harboring a minor," the officer announced, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "What?" Kelvin exclaimed, stepping back. Annabelle rushed to the door. "Mama, Papa, what are you doing?" "This is for your own good," Mrs. A. said, her voice trembling with a mist of anger and sorrow. The officers handcuffed Kelvin and led him out of the apartment. Annabelle screamed and tried to follow, but her father blocked her paths. "Or coming home with us," he said firmly. "No," Annabelle shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not when this ends here." The officer told the officer that he is not going anywhere with you. "You don't have a choice. Her mother says we have let you go too far. This ends now." Despite her protest, Mr. and Mrs. A. forced Annabelle into their car and drove her back home. The journey was tense and silent except for Annabelle occasionally let out sobs when they arrived. Annabelle stormed into the house, slamming the door to her room. Her parents followed the statement with determination. "This time we need to have a serious talk. You have embarrassed this family." Her father spoke out, his voice heavy. Do you even understand what you've done?" Annabelle glared at them. "Love Kelvin. You can't control my life forever." "Love," her mother shot back. "Is this what you so call it? What about your future?" "Annabelle, what about your education?" "I don't care about school," Annabelle yelled before her parents could respond. Annabelle's knees suddenly bucked, and she held her stomach, Annabelle crying. Her mother rushed to her side. Annabelle was taken to the hospital, where the doctors confirmed what her parents had feared the most. She was pregnant. Mrs. A broke down in tears, clutching her husband's arm. "Our daughter, she just 16. Mr. A looked away, his face etched with pain. When Annabelle woke up, her parents sat beside her bed, with angry faces and broken hearts. "Do you see what your disobedience has brought you?" her father said, his voice breaking. Annabelle turned her face away, unable to meet their eyes. She couldn't believe it herself when the doctor told them she was pregnant. As the reality of her situation sank in, Annabelle began to wonder if she made the biggest mistake of her life. News of Annabelle's pregnancy spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and even at the market women would stop talking as soon as they saw her. But it must painful blow that Janet and Fat, her closest pals, began to distance themselves from her. Annabelle. She called Janet one afternoon. "Can we sit tomorrow? I want to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm busy," Janet replied. "Cly, what about next tomorrow?" Anna pressed, hoping for a different answer. "Look, Annabelle," Janet said, her tone was cold. I don't think we should be seen together anymore. You've got baggage now." Annabelle's heart sank as the line dealt. Faith even stopped returning Annabelle's calls altogether at home. Tension ran high. Mr. and Mrs. A couldn't hide their anger. One evening, after a heated argument, her father made a decision. "You think you've grown up enough to make this choices? Fine. Go and live with Kelvin. You are his responsibility now," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. Annabelle's mother looked away, tears streaming down her face. "We tried to warn you, Annabelle. This is the life you chose." And even though Mrs. A didn't want her daughter to go, she couldn't go against her husband's decision. The following day, Annabelle found herself standing in front of Kelvin's apartment, with her bags and nowhere else to go. Callan opened the door, his face pale. "What are you doing here?" he asked, clearly unprepared for the situation. He was not ready to be father, so he had been scared since he heard the news of Annabelle's pregnancy. Was that why her parents released him from custody? Well, he would have preferred being in detention than having to deal with this. "My parents sent me here," Annabelle said quietly. "They said I should stay with you." Kelvin hesitated, but eventually stepped aside to let her in. If only Annabelle knew what she was walking into. Life with Kelvin was far from what Annabelle had imagined. The apartment was cramped and barely furnished. She noticed that Kelvin was jobless, and whatever money he had saved from gambling quickly ran out. Annabelle, who had been used to her parents' care, found herself cooking, cleaning and struggling to make ends. SMS days turned into weeks, and the reality of her situation became clearer. Kelvin spent most of his time with his friends, leaving Annabelle alone to deal with her pregnancy. "We need food," Annabelle said one evening, her voice trembling. "I don't have any money," he replied, shrugging. "Can't you call your parents?" "My parents," Annabelle's voice rose. "They sent me here. I'm your responsibility, not theirs." Kelvin sighed and walked out, leaving Annabelle in tears. As the months passed, Annabelle began to see the full consequences of her actions. Her once carefree life was now filled with struggle, and the love she thought she had found with Kelvin began to feel like a distant memory. Living with Kelvin became a nightmare for Annabelle. His initial indifference turned into open hostility. He would leave the house early and return late, often drunk and irritable. Annabelle, heavily pregnant and without support, bore the brunt of his frustration. "Callan, we don't even have anything in this house," Annabelle said one evening, clutching her growing belly. "That's your problem," Kelvin snapped, sitting on the "Figure it out." Tears wailed in Annabelle's eyes as she watched him light a cigarette, completely unmoved by her plight. She had not eaten all day, and the little money she had was long gone. Days bled into nights, and Annabelle's hunger became unbearable. She scavenged through the SP cupboards, finding nothing but a half-empty tin of Gary. She poured some into a bowl with water, her hands shaking as she ate the tasteless meal. "This isn't the life I wanted," she whispered to herself, tears streaming down her face. Kelvin's temper worsened as Annabelle's due date approached. He will yell at her for the smallest things, often blaming her for their predicament. "You brought this on yourself," he said one night after a heated argument. "I never asked you to come here." He went as far as beating her up. That night, not minding she was almost due for delivery. About a week later, Annabelle gave birth to a baby boy in a poorly equipped clinic. The experience was horrible, with no one by her side, except a kind midwife. When she returned to Kelvin's apartment with a baby, she hoped things would improve, but they only got worse. Kelvin's neglect turned to outright cruelty. He refused to buy baby supplies or food, leaving Annabelle to beg neighbors for help. The baby's cries echoed through the small apartment, a constant reminder of her suffering. One night, as she rocked her baby to sleep, Annabelle broke down. "I made the wrong choice," she admitted, her voice trembling. I should have listened to my parents. The next morning, Annabelle packed a small bag with her baby in her arms. She walked to her parents' house, her heart pounding with fear and shame. When she arrived, she stood outside the gate for several minutes, unsure of what to do. Finally, she had knocked. Mrs. E opened the door and froze. Annabelle, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Mama, I'm sorry, Annabelle said, falling to her knees. I made a mistake, please forgive me. Mr. Ayaza appeared behind his wife. His face, baby, they both looked horrible. It was obvious that they had been through a lot. Get up, Annabelle, he said quietly. Come inside. As Annabelle stepped into her childhood home, she felt a wave of relief. She knew she had a long road ahead to end back her parents' trust, but she was ready to start over. Annabelle's return to her parents' home was not without its challenges. Though Mr. and Mrs. A forgave her, they made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time. They supported her and her baby, ensuring they had food, shelter and care. You are our daughter, Annabelle, her mother often said, but this is a lesson you will carry with you forever. Annabelle took those words to heart. She devoted herself to caring for her baby. But the memories of her past mistakes haunted her. The news of her friends and classmates graduating from secondary school hit her hard. Janet and Faith posted pictures of their graduation day on social media, smiling in their gowns with their certificates in hand. Annabelle sat on her bed, staring at the images on her phone, tears streaming down her face. This could have been me, she whispered, clutching her baby clothes. Her friends deceived her. She could have been wise. Her parents encouraged her to return to school, but Annabelle was hesitant. The thought of walking back into a classroom filled her with anxiety. What will people say? She asked her mother. People will always talk, Mrs. A replied gently, but it's better to face them than to let their words define your future. Annabelle nodded, but couldn't shake her fear. Weeks turned into months, and though she hadn't yet gathered the courage to go back to school, the desire to do so grew stronger with each passing day. Every night as she rocked her baby to sleep, Annabelle reflected on her choices. She thought about the warnings she had ignored, the trust she had broken, and the opportunities she had missed. If only I had listened to Mama and Papa, she would think, her heart heavy with regrets. Though the path ahead seemed difficult, Annabelle vowed to make a better life for herself and her child. She learned to appreciate her parents' sacrifices and understood the value of their guidance. Her parents became a cautionary for others, a reminder that disobedience and poor choices could lead to consequences that would last a lifetime. As though Annabelle's journey was far from over, one thing was certain: she would never forget the hard lessons she had learned. And that was how the story of Annabelle ended. Thank you so much for listening to my story. My name is On, of On Stories and Bucktales, and please, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, kindly be a part of my growth. Please click on that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, so when I post more interesting stories and life lesson fielded stories like this, you'll be the first to get them. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, thank you so much for always coming back. Thank you for your support. I do not take it for granted. And please, if you haven't watched my other videos, trust me, I have interesting life lesson 5 videos that you would love to learn from. Please click on the subscribe button. If you haven't, see you in my next video. Bye bye.